Give it a sec for the uni Wi-Fi to decide to work. Perfect. Without further ado, I welcome the first speaker of the affirming team.
Due to the cost of living in New Zealand, thousands and thousands of people cannot afford to heat their homes in the winter. Due to the cost of energy, we're having to import coal that poisons our rivers and streams and ruins our natural planet. That is an untenable harm. That is something that side of firming is proud to get rid of. What do I have for you in today's speech? Firstly, I'm going to talk about how this will get us energy quicker, how we'll create this infrastructure more efficiently, and secondly, how this will get us a better quality of infrastructure. But before I move into my points, I'd just like to get some substantive. So firstly, what we're going to have is for the fast-track approval process, we'll have 3 ministers from relevant portfolios such as the treaty, the environment, etc., etc. We will have them discuss with these panel of experts. We'd like to note these aren't just going to be experts that are informed on like a single part of this issue. We want to have a broad, diverse panel of experts that are completely comprehensive on every facet of the issue that they're informing the panel of. So, moving on to the first point, it is how we get infrastructure quicker. As I outlined in my introduction, the biggest problem in today's debate is that energy is too expensive in New Zealand. If people cannot afford to heat their homes, so they have to freeze in the winter, that is something we will never abide by. So what does this now mean? It means that we have to import unclean, which looks like coal, energy sources from other areas. The result of this is that by having unclean energy, we have a distinct harm to our natural climate and our natural ecosystem by using non-renewable energy. Why do we change this? How do we change this? By using the fast-track approval process, we will get clean, renewable energy. How does this work? So the mechanism for this is that local councils are slow. Why are they slow? Firstly, there are 12 people in a local council versus 3 in our committee. We think they have a lot of other bureaucratic issues they have to deal with. This looks like 1,000 people complaining about the new cycleways. It looks like they have a lot of people to discuss before their issues, and for every local council meeting, they have a Karen coming and complaining about whatever they've done in the backyard. What does this mean? Looks like they are slow, they are bureaucratic, they do things badly. Why is central better? We've got a couple of reasons. Firstly, central government is quicker because they are trusted to do something. They have a mandate, which means that we think while there is oversight, there is scrutiny. One, it's done more efficiently because they have more facilities due to economies of scale, it is more efficient. Secondly, there is also more oversight after the process. Looks like TVNZ running an article on how well these career politicians actually did when they implemented this policy. Furthermore, we think there is less personal involvement, so they're more willing to buy the expert's opinion. Why do I think this is good? Because if my property value was going down when I implement this policy, there is a chance I will do the thing that is not best for the lives of these 5 million New Zealanders, if it means that me and my constituents are getting a worse quality of living. I'm going to be touching on that point a lot more later, so just hold back. So, we'd also like to note that central government is quicker. Why? I was more experienced. Why does this mean they're quicker? They're more capable of looking through all of this information, synthesizing and going, yes, that's the solution, let's go do it. So, what's the new outcome of this point? Immediately, due to central government being quicker and not being bogged down in all this bureaucratic nightmares, and they are quicker. We win this debate at the point where we just get energy to people who are currently freezing in their homes, we get them the energy cheaply so they can afford to heat their homes. That's the point we win. But secondly, we're now changing these market incentives to help our local climate and get more and more sources of clean energy. How does that work? Firstly, due to clean energy now being cheaper to make. Why is this cheaper and why is this quicker? Because they don't have to go through all of these hoops. They can just go straight to the fast-track approval process and get this done. We're now getting more energy in the country, more clean energy. That means it's now financially inviable to go get coal-sourced energy. What does this mean? Less non-renewable sources. There's also changes the incentive, because if I want to go open up a coal mine, but I have to wait 6 months for this local council to do something, I'll be like, ooh, let's not do that. Instead, if I go, let's open up a hydropower plant, what do? 3 weeks, and the cabinet members have looked over this, and it's done. That's the point that I'm going to absolutely jump on. It's so much more quicker, it's so much more efficient. That changes the incentives on actually creating these. Now, before I move on to my second point, which is how we get better quality outcomes of infrastructure, Take a POI.
Who has more of an incentive to care for minorities, the South Auckland Local Board or a national cabinet?
I have a couple of responses to that. Firstly, we think the local cabinet actually has a greater incentive. Why? Because these are career politicians. If a local councillor makes a decision that's bad and they get called out on it, they can just move to another region, get a different job. We think that's pretty okay. If a career politician is caught out doing something incredibly stupid, they will be shunned in the media, they will lose their job. That's a massive harm they can't cop. Furthermore, 3 cabinet ministers are all trying to make sure that they get the perfect result, otherwise they look really bad. But actually, we don't care that much. Why? Because we have 5 million New Zealanders who, and if 1 million of these people can't afford to heat their homes, do we really care what's happening to the 10,000 people in Timaru? No. We care about we care about the majority of the people in this country, and we think that the harms and the benefits happening to that million people in New Zealand who can't afford to heat their homes is so much more prevalent than these people getting whatever harm they're trying to outline. Now, moving on to the next one, which is why we get better quality infrastructure. So we think that local government at the end of the day can't make a decision as well as central. Let me walk you through those points, why this happens. Firstly, what are the incentives acting on a local council member? If it's a pretty trashy local council member, they're just there to look after their own property value. If they are the best local council member, they're there to look after their constituents' property value. No matter where they sit on that sliding scale, creating a new hydro dam in their region will push down the property values in that area. That is bad for the constituents. That means that the best local council member will never actually endorse that policy and it will never go ahead. That being said, on side F, we get that hydro dam. Why does side F need to get that hydro dam? Because we can get rid of coal and we can now have enough energy that people can afford to no longer have to spend exorbitant amounts of money trying to heat their homes, which we think in most cases they just don't do and now they have to suffer, right? That is the benefit that we claim. Now, the next point is that local councils can't see the big picture. Central government can. What does this now mean? Local council over here, we're making a dam, local council over here, we're making a dam, local council over here, we're making a dam. Central government, we're going to make one dam there, we'll make a wind farm over there, and we'll have another dam over there. We think because central government can see the broader picture, they're going to make more effective decisions because they can actually, instead of having to just hope that local governments make the right decision, they can say, yes, this is the plan, let's go do it. That's a massive benefit for central government because they can actually coordinate things. Now, moving on to the next point. We think there is a world in which someone wants to make an incredibly harmful project. What does this look like? It looks like they want to make a project that is just generally speaking a negative of this region and it's untenable harm. Why is that not going to happen more on our side of the house? We think that central government is less likely to be corrupt. Why? There is more oversight over central government. There is more scrutiny over central government, and if there is any corruption that exists in central government, it is infinitely more likely to be caught than the backwater Timaru, who had to run their election twice because no one actually decided to run for being a local representative, right? So we think there is so much more scrutiny in central government, there is going to be less bribery and less, just bad decisions being made. Now, moving on from this point, we get another point, which is that they'll be able to engage with these experts better. A couple of reasons why this works. We'd like to note that people in central government are probably able to are probably more experienced. In central government, they'll always be more experienced because they have done this 1,000 times over. What this means is that when they work with these experts, they're more likely to have this good information, be able to synthesize quicker, ask salient questions. Furthermore, though, we think that when it comes to people in central government, they also are no longer part of this local area, so they're going to be immune from bias. We think this bias will exist in a local government level, no matter who they talk to. They will never be able to actually get unbiased information at a local government level, and we think that's terrible. So what's the result of this? You never get effective infrastructure, but ignoring that infrastructure point, we won this debate when we said we're going to get the people who need power the most, power. We're going to get the people who can't heat their houses to be able to do that, and that is when we win this debate. We are proud to affirm.
I thank the speaker for their speech and I invite the first speaker of the negating team to open their team's case.
I'd like to start by pointing out
it's important to see we still get renewable energy, right? Councils and ministers still want to build it because it's popular, it caters to locals, they want to be seen as politically correct, and it ensures long-term health of a nation or region. So this is not a debate about one side gets renewable energy, one side doesn't. This is a debate purely about the local councils and centralisation, right? So the way I'm going to win this debate is by proving that the side effects of fast tracking are very detrimental, specifically to Māori people, right? I'll be starting with rebuttal before going to my first point on bias, my second point on centralisation. So important to point out, they start their case by saying that actually these ministers are going to have so many experts with them, they're going to be consulting with them for such a long time, right? They're going to take in every opinion. This means that you don't actually save time. You're consulting with a large group of people, just like how you would have to normally, so you're not actually fast-tracking anything. You're keeping it under the same amount of time, nothing's changed, right? Then they discuss how local councils are slow, they have to talk to lots of people that come up to them with their issues. Well, ministers deal with the entire nation. Isn't that far more people than like maybe a small town of 6,000 people like Richmond? I think there's far more issues that 5 million people face rather than 6,000, right? And note, when they say that the government has mandate, they can construct it because they have more resources, the government's not building this infrastructure, it's companies, as worded by the motion. It doesn't matter if the government has more resources when it's the company doing the construction in the first place, right? And then there's even more discussion that, businesses will jump on, like, building this renewable energy because it's going so fast. But councils don't want people freezing to death, right? They are willing to prioritize getting this power out in the first place so that people aren't freezing to death. So we think they're willing to, speed it up by a bit anyways, right? And note here, right, that they mention there'll be people like the treaty minister, but it's going to be people with relevant portfolios. The treaty minister is not a relevant portfolio to constructing renewable power. So it's not likely that they get appointed there. And even if it is, right, and even if they look after all the Māori, then he's just going to get outvoted by other ministers who do not care, as I'll discuss in my point about bias, right? Finally, there's this discussion about corruption. This will be more corrupt because local councils have less oversight, but they literally live in the communities that vote for them. Ministers do not live in the communities that they're going to be impacting. So if the local councillor has to deal with the fact that everyone's going to see him walking home, knowing that he did something corrupt, doing something against their interest. So I think at that point, they're actually less corrupt, right? We flip that. So, let's touch on bias. Note here, ministers have the final say. They don't actually have to listen to this council of 40 billion experts that they try to say, right? So, they have incentives. One, the masses. The masses elect the ministers. They must be catered to. The media are always going to portray building clean energy as good to everyone else because it's a buzzword. It's the thing. It's hard to paint as bad when there's so many seemingly so many benefits to it, and a lot of people support it, right? So that means there's no incentive to actually consult with people in the region, but there's no incentive to consult with minorities, right? Because it's never politically advantageous to support minorities. It's extremely hard to find out if they consult with them in the first place because cabinet's confidential. And even if they do, there's no incentive for them to care because by nature, they are a minority. They are less of a vote than the majority, right? Then they have an incentive on donors, second of all. Donors fund parties. Elections are expensive. They need money to do that, and they want something in return. So we think it's they're far more likely to donate if they fast-tracked, considered first, because they're getting a tangible benefit out of when they benefit and support a party financially, right? And thirdly, a party bias. You must toe the party line to maintain power. You can get fired and lose your job as a minister, right? You're not a neutral actor. You follow the party's opinions and lines. You must follow the PM's guidance, right? You get appointed by the Prime Minister. They're not going to choose a rogue MP as a minister. They're going to choose the most loyal person to the party. So what does all of this mean? First of all, it means that Māori voices are going to be ignored, which means that constructions are going to take place over spiritually significant land that gets built over. Because note here that not all land that Māori consider significant is owned by them, and that it's a niche topic. Not every Tom, Dick, and Harry knows about the specific lands that a specific group of Māori consider important to them. It's a very niche topic, right? And when that's built over, you lose part of that spiritual connection. You cannot properly engage with your own culture. You lose a part of yourself, which is incredibly detrimental. It's a facet of your culture that you're losing, right? We think this is far more harmful than what they're trying to say. They're trying to say that they're willing to overlook it. Well, these people have historically been overlooked so much. If they're willing to overlook them anymore, I think that's very bad, right?
On that point,
to continue here with some likelihood analysis, there's a lot of anti-Māori rhetoric in the news. David Seymour wants to repeal the Waitangi, right? He wants to repeal that sort of stuff. There's a lot of immediate attention against these people, right? So we think it's very likely that they're just going to get overlooked and ignored, right? And then you see that it's built on conservation land, right? This is land that has lots of wildlife. It still has that spiritual connection. So you're actually harming the climate when you build over this to build your windmill farm, when you're cutting down all the trees in the forest to accommodate that, right? And the people that live near that land are now missing that conservation land that they consider so socially important to them because they go out there to visit every day, right? They go out there to have a good time, right? The comparative here is that their voices are heard on our side of the house. Their opinions are taken into account, and therefore none of this happens on our side. I'll take a point now.
How do you tell a poor single Māori mother whose family can't afford heating that you're just helping her?
We tell her that because we're going to be building power anyways to help her out. And second of all, we're taking into consideration all of her thoughts and feelings about the land that might be spiritually significant to her as a person. Whereas on your side, you're probably not going to get that, right? So, to move on to councils, right? Centralisation of power. Councils are losing more and more power, right? An example of this is the replacement of the elected councils by the government in Tauranga, or the threat of removal in Wellington, and turnout in local elections is already a bit low, right? So first of all, we think that the reduced function of councils, right? The job of councils is to make decisions as representatives of their community, and their side overrides this with central government, right? Second of all, it bypasses democracy. An example of this is Wellington, which overwhelmingly voted Labour and Greens for their councillors, but would have local decisions made by national and act ministers instead. And this applies to every region where the council is not the ruling party, right? And third of all, it appeals to the masses. The central government is elected by the whole country, so they can screw over specific areas without being punished, right? They don't have to risk losing the election if they only harm one small group of people, right? So this means minority communities are especially vulnerable, like South Auckland. Right, so the impact here is there's an erosion of faith in government when you constantly see them acting against you and your interests, even though you voted for your local councillors, they just get ignored, right? You're not likely to engage with the system anymore. You're likely to be mad at it. The fact that it's overriding your God-given right to vote for who you think should represent you. You get less engagement in the local government, therefore, right? Which leads to polarization. You start getting extremely mad about this. You're much more likely to start acting irrationally when you constantly see your decisions are getting overruled by the big man in government rather than... And this means overall, you get less accountability because the government's not accountable to these small groups of people, right? So comparatively, the South Auckland Local Board has an incentive to care for these minorities because, first of all, they care about the local community because they live there, want the best for these community. They are elected by these very same minorities, so they have a much larger incentive when their career hinges on that, and they were probably raised in the area. If they've got such a good connection to it, they can get voted into it, right? So we think at the end of the day, local councils are more likely to take into consideration these minority voices and therefore better plan for them. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I invite the second speaker of the affirming team to continue today's case.
Only 40% of New Zealand land is developed for things that the country needs. All of that 60% is then split between whatever council is closest to it, but actually we think the opportunity lost for the country where we don't get to develop that land, where we don't get to provide energy to South Auckland, where we don't get to help that poor single mother is actually unacceptable, and we would rather fast track the approval process. We think it is unacceptable if a random council who's closest to that undeveloped land gets to say in the name of their community that they don't want a project done. We think that's unacceptable because the problem in this debate is that the places that need energy the most and the people that will in future need to not feel the impacts of climate change the most are not the same people who are making these decisions. Because currently, the land where it's most the land where it's most accessible and efficient to create these renewable energy sources is not the same land as where people need to use that energy. And actually, we think that giving the responsibility of making that decision to central government will fix that disparity in terms of how the Southland Council will refuse to do an energy development project, but actually that will just detrimentally affect the rest of New Zealand far more than the little bit of noise that it would create for the people of Southland, right? So I'm going to talk about two things in this speech. Firstly, on cutting red tape, and secondly, on the accessibility of energy, right? And I think that those two things are very intrinsically linked. But firstly, on why we get more agreements and less blocks to progress. I'm going to talk about the local council incentives, because I think we get good analysis from the affirmative team on why local councils have their people in mind and why central government has everyone in mind. And I think that that works for our side, right? Because with something as big as energy infrastructure, you want to be thinking about everyone it affects. And in the case of energy infrastructure, in a climate where it's changing, in a climate of extreme and drastic climate change, you do actually have to think about everyone in New Zealand and also the people in the future. So local council members look like people who love their community, people who think they're a good representation of those views, and also people who are quite certain that their opinions are right? And note that while some of these things stand in central government, they are still very different people to cabinet ministers, because as they explain so nicely, cabinet ministers are tied pretty heavily to their party's interests and priorities. And even if they are an electorate MP, they probably are thinking that their party policies are at the forefront of their mind, especially in a system where your role is as the head of the environment portfolio or the treaty portfolio, right? So from that, we think that cabinet ministers are more likely to take the important people's needs into account. We don't think they're going to ignore the local community that is saying it's going to be too noisy to have this construction, right? We think that it's in their interest to still get those people's votes, but we think that it's also important to them that those 1 million Aucklanders have the lights on in their home. Therefore, cabinet ministers are less focused on a specific group's priorities like a council is, and are more focused on countrywide outcomes. We think that that is a massive benefit in this debate, because we're talking about everyone in New Zealand, because it's about energy and that affects everyone. Although we accept that when you're building infrastructure, it's important to take local community needs into account, far too often in the status quo, projects are dumped because there is too much public backlash on the local level, and councillors need to and want to pander to their people. We don't blame them for this because it's their job, but we support taking that burden of decision and consultation off of their biased hands and giving it to central government, uniquely because energy infrastructure isn't just about the community it's built. It's about all the people who deserve cheap energy, all the people in the future who will suffer if the council rejects the clean energy proposal or has to drag the approval process out for a year while the councillors bicker about how many meters the solar panels should be apart from each other, about which long-term plan they should write up the proposal in, right? We think this is really important because with an issue as eminently destructive and massively impactful as climate change, any action is important. Any decrease in the time it takes to get more solar power in this country is a crucial step to take, and to take as fast as we can. We think we do it faster because we do have a net decrease in those 9 councillors who we would otherwise have bickering about the project. We increase the ratio of solar and coal, and it's not of solar to coal, and it's not just a cool perception thing where we're clean, green New Zealand, right? This saves lives. It saves lives forever when our air has fewer carbon particles in it. It saves countless lives lost in future disasters like Cyclone Gabrielle, disasters that only increase in severity and frequency as we burn oil and coal exponentially, as we exponentially heat up the atmosphere. But on a more personal note, because yes, it is important to think about people's current daily needs, I'm going to talk about the accessibility of energy, but first I'll take a point of information.
Given that the ETS is a thing, how do you actually get lower emissions?
I'm not sure what that acronym refers to, but I'm going to assume that it's some form of environmental regulation scheme. Listen, environmental regulation schemes are great, but they're very expensive and often don't get much done, especially when we're talking about a project that is always going to be beneficial to the environment, even if for a little bit it pollutes that one dam, right? Because as I've just explained to you, for hundreds of years, people will feel the effects of climate change if we don't act now. But on the accessibility of energy, why is it important that energy is clean and cheap? Firstly, on what it currently looks like. We still use exorbitant amounts of coal and oil in this country. Our energy infrastructure takes a long time to get approved because firstly, it has to get approved through council. We know that they don't do much and they don't do it very quickly, right? But secondly, it's a very wide-reaching thing. It's a very big undertaking, and the council has lots of very prevalent and very heavily complained about things to deal with before they do the energy infrastructure thing, right? So that means that energy companies have to spend lots of money planning, proposing, and carrying out these projects, and then that cost gets passed down to consumers consumers when we finally buy that energy. And as we explained to you at our first speech, in a very expensive state of the country, in other areas that are also really pressing to people like food, rent, and childcare, power often has to be the last on the list for a struggling family, and that leaves children with freezing bedrooms, that leaves pregnant mothers making formula with cold water, that ends up giving their child health issues. That ends up with school kids and university students studying in the dark. Energy is livelihood. We can't accept a world where it's too expensive for people to afford, where it's too expensive for people to have their daily necessities met. So what do we think it looks like after we implement this, right? A, there's more of it. There just is, because we fast-track the approval process. That's how it works, because it's much easier now to get approval for a very productive but like slightly noisy wind farm, right? Like, we think that's the cop-out that councils are actually making sometimes when they say, we're not going to do this because our community's going to like send us emails because the wind farm is too loud, right? But we actually think that it's more important that families in South Auckland, including Māori families, by the way, Māori families need power. They're being affected by both sides of the debate. Don't know how the negating team can say that we're harming minorities in this debate when we're talking about something that everyone needs to survive. Listen, this much more productive but slightly louder wind farm gets approved under our side of the house. Under their side, it's like diminished in efficacy by a local council at best, and it's cancelled at worst. And under our side, companies therefore supply more energy. New companies emerge, and the competition mechanism then brings prices down because we have more of a supply and demand, So that's a child with a hot meal in a warm bedroom. That is a mother able to heat up her baby's formula to the correct and healthy temperature. That is a student studying not only with the lights on, but also with a desk side heater. That's a massive benefit to 1 million New Zealanders. Now that we've imagined that world, we can't fathom why you wouldn't support it, right? But secondly, that energy that they're all using is now a larger ratio of clean to unclean, because it's much easier now for companies to do a renewable energy project, right? Under their side, these companies are picking between, should I start a coal project? Should I start a dam project? And either way, it's going to be a long bureaucratic process for them, so they're just going to choose the cheapest, and often coal is the cheapest. But under our side, a company has an extra incentive to pick that clean energy, to pick that cheap energy for this country.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I welcome the second negating speaker to continue today's debate.
Centralisation. Ultimately, Wellington Gold fails to win when they put their entire case contingent on getting cheaper power and then fail to mechanise that. They just asserted that. Secondly, they fail to win when they cannot protect minority rights and they have to get up and concede this at their next speech. And thirdly, they fail to win when their coaches never got Aiden in to yap at them about the emissions trading scheme. In my speech today, I'm going to be doing some rebuttal. I'm going to be delivering my main substantive points on minorities and then on the actual price of power. And then I'm going to be whipping some material, going over the last bits of characterisation because it's getting too late in this debate for us to disagree on these things. Okay, so the very first thing that we hear from the first speaker's mouth, and this continues throughout the debate, is about the cost of living. What we hear is that somehow quicker power makes it cheaper. They're saying that there's this trade-off, right? That the trade-off is going to be between quick power and expensive power. We don't think this is true. What we think the actual trade-off is between quick power and quality power, between quick power and a larger quantity of power. So on our side, even if it takes us 3 weeks longer to consent to it, we are always going to be better off at the point when we get a higher quality of power and we get more power plants actually in there. Because when there's not enough to go around, we've seen what happens. The lights go out and Wellington Gold becomes Wellington Coal. Okay, so next on rebuttal. What they said is that councils are going to oppose projects because the best councillor is always going to vote based on the property value of their neighbours. Firstly, councillors clearly care about more than this because they want to get re-elected. Most voters are going to be thinking on a longer time frame than this. But also, what about job creation and regional development? There's plenty of incentives for councillors to approve these projects, so we don't think it's a problem where councillors aren't approving the projects. What we think the problem that your team needs to try and solve is the time that it takes to get these power plants in there, rather than like whether these power plants get there or not. Think of the 1970s, right? Manapodi created jobs, created an entire city because they like built a huge power station. Think of the Clyde Dam. All of these are examples in New Zealand where they put large-scale infrastructure and it was great for the region. Yes, it probably took more than 7 days to consent that. Now they talk about unclean energy, and they can tell you some really great outcomes with strong rhetoric about carbon particles in the air and coal in the rivers. The problem with this is that it just doesn't work. Under the emissions trading scheme, if you take carbon consumption away from one area, the market cap will mean that another factory somewhere that can choose between using renewable energy or fossil fuels is only going to use fossil fuels. You cannot reduce New Zealand's fossil fuel emissions through changing where it comes from. And actually, even if you don't buy that, we don't buy this idea that New Zealand is responsible for enough of the carbon emissions that we're actually going to have any control over how much carbon is in the air. Okay, so now that we've cleared that up, just please note that panel, that's really important. At the point where they fail to get emissions, they cannot get a better climate nor a better environment. So now they talk about cheap energy, and again, they can try and beat us at our own game because we're going to win on minorities. I'll tell you about that in my substantive. They try and beat us at our own game by saying, well, what if the power goes out in South Auckland? They're talking about getting cheaper energy, right? As I've told you, this is just entirely asserted. They haven't mechanised why it gets cheaper. But even if we buy this, wouldn't this just be another incentive for councils to approve power plants if it makes it cheaper? This incentive is not exclusive to their side, so therefore they cannot claim this problem of councillors not passing these energy stations. I'll talk more about the price of energy later in my substantive. So then we asked them in a POI, why is Cabinet going to look out for Māori on their side of the house? And the response we got is because they're career politicians. Career politicians have always been trusted to look after Māori, to look after minorities, because clearly that is politically advantageous. I will quote our Lord and Saviour, the Right Honourable Sir Geoffrey Palmer, when I say this. It is never, ever politically advantageous to look after minorities because necessarily they do not have the voter base to outweigh majority votes. Okay, note here, they conceded they don't mind harming Timaru. This is the problem with their case. It is not a dichotomy that we have to choose from. There is no trade-off between looking after Timaru and looking after New Zealand's power needs. You can have both. You can look after Timaru, you can look after New Zealand's power needs. It probably takes more than a week. You can have both. You just have to actually do the groundwork, do the consultation, do what the community wants.
On that point.
And you have to vote neg. So the trade-off here is actually going to be about fast-tracking versus quantity of power stations. It's going to be about fast-tracking versus the quality of power stations. I'll take a point.
Do you think the Timaru Council cares more about the energy supply to the whole country or how many letters they get in the post about how loud the windmills are?
Well, I don't know if you've ever been to Timaru, but it's not on a secret power grid that's separate from the rest of the country. The lights go off in Auckland, they go off in Timaru. So they don't care any less about power generation, right? What they do care about is whether or not their local community is going to be screwed over by having a new housing development that land taken up by a massive dam, which could have just gone elsewhere if the cabinet ministers had thought about it for more than a week. Okay, now I'm going to be moving on to minorities, because we think that we can win here alone at the point where they actually cannot guarantee that these people are cared for. We think that our mechanisms here should be rated particularly highly, because obviously we're caring for vulnerable people who have been harmed previously. So Riley clearly outlined our point on minorities and how they just cannot look after them. I flagged in a POI, what incentive does the government have to look after minorities compared to the actual community made up of minorities? Think of the South Auckland Local Board. Their entire response was just, we'll put the Treaty Minister in the room. We don't think this is charitable, but even if we buy it, I'm going to take down their major point right now. So why would the Treaty Minister be in this group of 3 ministers over the Minister for Resources, for RMA, for Construction, Energy, Regional Development, Environment, Climate Change, Just Transition? There are so many portfolios that would be more applicable than the Treaty Minister, than the Māori Crown Relations Minister. So at that point, you are not going to get the Treaty Minister into the room. But even if we buy that, even if somehow we get them into the room, they're just going to be loyal to the party, not loyal to Māori. Think of Shane Verti voting in favour of the cigarette legislation when his own iwi asked him not to. He's loyal to Lupton because that's who's going to give him a promotion. Think of Tama Pōtaka. He's loyal to Luxon, not to Māori. So even somehow, if they do the right thing and do the right thing by Māori instead of do the right thing by Luxon, they're just going to be outvoted by the other two ministers who've been put in there by the government not to look after Māori, but to look after resources or RMA or construction. Note that this is my large sustained push, and at the end of that, we have dealt to that point. So, bit of meta. Their entire case is contingent on this assertive push about the cost of power and how that somehow outweighs minorities, how it outweighs the centralisation of power, which we brought you at Riley. Note that the trade-off here isn't the trade-off that they have to make. The trade-off that they have to make is about the quality of power and about the quantity. So on political capital, if by your own misfortune you live in Karori and you happen to be a mountain biker, you see a wind farm in Marketa Mountain Bike Park, which was actually considered, by the way. You don't like wind farms anymore because they've gone and like annoyed you by putting it somewhere where you used to enjoy. Secondly, there's backlash because it's extra media. It's like high visibility when you fast track something. Thirdly, people don't like that like renewable energy is fast tracked instead of roads. We need to get back on track. And finally, there's only so many wind farms that the public is going to like, and the faster that this happens, the more voters feel like it's a Lorax government gone mad with woe. So at the end of the day, at this point, they get less wind farms because of the political capital. They get lower quality wind farms and dams because of the lack of consultation. They screw over minorities and they fail to get cheaper power. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I invite the third affirming speaker to close the sit-down.
Starting my speech in 3, 2.
Power is distributed by region. There is a split between what region has space for power and what region needs it to be cheaper, right? So then we see that things are lowered their prices because of the new farm, and that benefit is felt the most by those in these urban communities. 3 clashes for you here today. Firstly, who gets more energy? Secondly, who gets the cheapest and most effective energy here? And within that, that's also renewable stuff. And then thirdly, on helping vulnerable people. I'm firstly going to start by asking a quick question to side negating. Where are you making this energy? Because you've told us a lot about how these communities are going to be, especially at Second, you've told us these communities are going to be annoyed about the fact that they're having these windmills in their biking range or whatever, right? What we're hearing here is that actually, like we've told you from first, the people in those local councillors are going to be people are going to be annoyed about these windmills, and so they're actually never going to build that energy, right? That's what we see happening on your side of the case. That's what we think the comparative is. So going into this idea of who's getting more energy, they've kind of come out and told us we need energy so we'll get it, right? We don't actually think that this is a fair thing to say because, well, yes, we need energy. We don't necessarily need to get renewable and clean energy. We just want to because we know that it will have the best outcomes for New Zealanders, which I'll talk more on later, right? And so we think that, like right now, when it's easier and less disruptive for local councils to have to deal with some people sending more mail in saying, oh, it's so annoying having this extra sound or having this construction, they are always instead going to go to another place, right? They're always going to get this more harmful but easier to get coal type energy, right? And so we think that that's always going to be harmful, right? What we see on our side of the house, the comparative there, is because clean energy specifically is going through the fast track process, it is easier to get than unclean energy, and so we think that just on that, you're more likely to get it. You're going to get more energy because it's easier, and people that want to get energy, corporations that are trying to
make these infrastructure projects, they're going to be more incentivized to make these clean infrastructure projects because that's what's faster, that's what gets you approved fast, and that's what gets you into it and gets you into the market for the long run. So that's why we see that that's always going to have more energy there, right? We've also told you from the start that central is more likely to work. Like I've kind of been talking about in this debate, in this point here, right, is that we believe that local councillors always have their direct incentive is to their local community, whereas the central government's incentive is always to the whole of New Zealand. Power is an issue that is so, is an issue that is so important to every single New Zealander. It is so important to their livelihoods. So we think that it's always better when we have these people who are caring about everyone. They've also quickly to flag something that they said before of like, oh, Timaru does actually care about power. We think even if Timaru does care about the power in Auckland, which we've told you before we don't actually think they do, we don't think local councillors have that incentive, we think Timaru doesn't want it in their backyard, right? We think Timaru can absolutely say, yeah, it would be cool if Auckland had better power, but it would harm us, it would be really annoying for a little bit of time, so we don't actually care, go somewhere else. We think that there's less of that, like, incentive to have it right there, and we think it's much easier for local councillors to say go somewhere else, right? So at the end of the day, what we get here is we're getting faster energy, it's cleaner energy, and it's more, it's considerably more, and this is really important here because they've given us no case where they get more energy, and we think that's what's the most important point in this case, in this debate today. We want more energy so people can have access to more energy so they can live, right? Now, yeah, I'll take a PLI.
Renewables go out, so why would your power be cheaper when you get less wind farms built and you have to pay for a fossil fuel backup?
So, on to cheaper, right? First of all, I don't think that's fair, that specific POI is fair to contend your case on. We think that, like, actually any form of power can fail, and we think that it's always better that renewable energy is our first option, and then our backup option can be there to be like coal, than just using coal and harming our environment more, when we can instead do this, which is getting better impact. So, onto this point of like cheaper energy. Firstly, I'd like to quickly directly respond to what they just told us before, that we quote asserted cheaper energy. That is not true, and it has not been true from the start. From our first affirmative, we have told you exactly why you're going to get cheaper energy here. Why are we going to get cheaper energy here? Well, because, that's a great question. Because it's going to be it's going to be a faster thing that's done, and there's going to be more of it, right? And so we think that there's always going to now, because we're getting more energy in, right? Because, like I told you before, we're getting more projects approved, right? There's now going to be more energy in the country, and so that is always going to be cheaper, and that is always going to be being people there. I don't need to expand on that much because we've told you that down the line, right? I just think it's important to know that no, we haven't been asserting that, and we think that's really unfair to say. We've also talked about like market incentives and that kind of stuff, right? So what we're hearing again here, I think it's really important to note, is that even when we don't get cheaper energy, even if this point is not true at all, they also don't get cheaper energy. So at the end of the day, even if this point is completely not true, and even if you buy that actually we've been asserting everything and every mechanism that we've given you is null, right? We just get the same price of energy, but we get more energy, and it's cleaner energy, which is always going to be helpful for more people, and is going to be helpful for our environment long term. So what we're getting here is we're getting more energy. We think it is going to be cheaper, but even if it's not, it's going to be cleaner energy, which, moving on to my third point, is actually going to be helping vulnerable people and our environment, right? So what they've basically told us here is that A, we're screwing over minorities, and B, people would get mad. To start on this point of screwing over minorities, they've tried to say that this is the most important thing in this case. We actually don't think it is the most important thing because, like we've told you from the end, A, this is going to be helping everybody, right? Having more energy, having cleaner energy, having cheaper energy actually helps everybody, right? Because everybody needs energy, right? So we think in that way, minorities are going to be happy. We think that if a minority gets cheaper energy, they're going to be like, that's awesome. No one's going to be mad about that. What we think the difference here is we think that, yeah, it is like potential that there is some case where there is a slight negative shift towards something that a minority finds important because we think that, A, we're never going to get really bad infrastructure projects in because, like we've told you, and career politicians and politicians in general, especially when it is just 3 guys, right? We think it's very important for them to not face backlash directly to them because we think it is very easy to face backlash directly to the 3 guys who were supposed to be supporting you, right? And so we think that they're not going to go through with projects that are just going to be harming minorities. We think when they do harm minorities, it's at a very small scale. And we think at that point, it is much more important to help every single person in New Zealand, including those minorities in some way, even if it does harm them in a small amount, right? And we don't think that it actually will be. We don't actually care that much if people get a little bit angry. And so what we're getting there at the end of this debate is we're getting faster, cleaner, renewable energy, which is helping our climate, which is helping everyone overall. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I invite the third negating speaker to continue this debate.
I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Both sides in this debate want renewable energy. Both sides in this debate want to help people. On our side of the house, we just cannot stand for doing this with the added side effects of bias, of corruption, and of harming very, very vulnerable minority communities, which is an exclusive harm on their side of the house. We are still going to be helping these people in the long term. They cannot claim that as an exclusive benefit to their side. So let's look at the debate, right? What have we seen? We see firstly we've had a bit of a clash on representation, who's going to be impacting these local communities, these minorities within them, and then secondly, who's going to be building like the faster, better renewable energy in this debate. So let's start on the first thing here. I'd just like to note that this is the most important point in this debate because it is vulnerable people who are going to be feeling a very, very deep harm. You're impacting their spiritual well-being, you're impacting their homeland, their connection to their whenua, you're impacting centuries-long connection to this place, and we cannot just be ignoring that and allowing central governments to consent and fast-track bills in areas which they deem as culturally significant, even if they are not legislated as so. So what have we seen here? What are the local council incentives? This has been a large clash. What did they tell us? They told us that they have a personal property value incentive, that they just don't want to do anything there. They told us that local councils don't have enough experience to do this, and they have too much bias to actually make good decisions for their community. Why is this just blatantly untrue? Firstly, we see that local councils are elected democratically, which is completely different to how ministers are elected. Elected ministers are appointed by the Prime Minister. Local councils are voted in by the people in those communities. They're voted in by the communities and they are accountable to them, right? This means that they do not have this bias that they tell us about their property values. Sure, they may have a little bit of bias there, but more so they're accountable to the people, because if they are not accountable, then they're going to lose all of their optics, their power stuff, but that comes into play a little bit later as well, right? Secondly, they told us here about, in response to the big picture stuff, right? Each council is not some individual body that just has no idea what's going on in the rest of the country. This is an unfair characterisation that cannot stand in this debate. Obviously, one council is going to know if Auckland is building a dam, and they're probably not going to follow suit because they could make more money by building a wind farm. This is just something that they cannot tell us, right? This is just not true. Lastly here on experience, councillors often actually have many years experience on their council because they're trusted by their communities. They're voted in time and time again because they are representing their communities well and they're doing what is right for them. This means that they're able to ask more relevant questions than some central minister who actually doesn't have any knowledge about the specific local community that they are wanting to build something in. So what's their comparative on their side of the house? They told us that career politicians have far less bias, of course, because they've never been known to have bias in the past. They completely ignored all of our material that we brought you out at Riley, explaining why they're vulnerable to so many different types of bias, to the political and financial, and bias to the masses, and they have not responded well enough for this to just not be in the debate anymore. Career politicians experience all this bias, which local government bodies do not experience, right? What did they tell us here then? They told us that local bodies are more vulnerable to corruption somehow, even though it's a larger group of people who is more representative to the community, versus 3 people who get appointed who actually have no input in the community, they don't engage with them, and they are less accountable to the actual people. If corruption is going on in your local government, that person is just not going to be voted in again. If corruption is going on with a minister, no one's even going to know about it. It's never going to be addressed, and it's going to fly under the radar. Lastly here on their comparative rate, even if you don't buy any of this, right? Even if they are like 95% correct and almost all of their decisions are going to be unbiased and correct, that 5% of the time when they get it wrong, when they build something on iwi land, when they build something in an area that is spiritually very, very important to people, this harm cannot be ignored. This harm is so detrimental to their case that it will still win us the debate, because this is such a deep harm and we're still able to get their benefits in the long term, that we are able to win the debate on this alone, even if you don't buy any of the material that I have just bought you. Yeah, I'll take your point now.
Does a South Auckland Māori woman care more about spiritual harms in Timaru or being able to heat the formula that her baby needs?
I'm actually about to get to that, thank you. So, moving on to my second point here about who's going to build faster and better energy, right, for each community. What have they told us here, right? Firstly, let's look at the local councils again. What have they told us? And what do we see on our side of the house, right? Well, we see that on our side of the house, it's actually profitable to be building these cheaper renewable energy things in your community, because let's say we take all of their buys that they make, it's still beneficial to them. That person is now getting, right, cheaper power. That person now has better optics. They're now going to stay in power because people like them, because they built renewable energy in their local community. They still feel these incentives. So even if we take their characterization of this terrible bias, we're still able to get that. Secondly, they do have actually more oversight. They are more accountable to people than a minister who has been appointed. Why is this? Because they're able to be approached by public. Public are allowed to come in, submit, listen to their meetings. It's not all confidential and kept under wraps like it is for ministers, right? Thirdly here, they have a more diverse, more democratic view over a local community. This is very, very important in this debate, because ministers, there's only 3 of them. Even if somehow a minister for the treaty manages to get on one of the 3 positions, which we don't think is likely in the first place because they are not the most relevant group, they are going to be overpowered by the other 2. They are not going to have a voice, and then they are not allowed to speak out. They are silenced by the other 2 because they're not allowed to go against their party. We bought all of this at first, right? Thirdly on this, local councils aren't just going to turn down prospecting communities. They're not just going to refuse this. This was just a claim that was not mechanised well. So why is this not true, right? Well, we see that they're not going to, because it's profitable for them. They're not having to pay. If a company's coming to them and saying, hey, can we build this here? Well, we'll build it. You don't have to pay for it. Of course they're going to let that go through. Secondly here, if they were going to turn it down due to backlash, right, if a proposal has caused enough anger and enough concern to be dropped by a local council, we don't see this as something that should be going through on your side of the house. If a local council and the people within that region were so unhappy with the decision that was going to go through, we do not believe that it could ever be beneficial that it would go through on your side of the house. It is going to be harming people enough that they are so angry to cause so much backlash that it's just going to be dropped by a local council. How is this beneficial on your side of the house? All right, so that kind of covers most of the local council kind of incentives here. What did they tell us after this? What was their comparative? Well, basically what they told us is that a large minister, like the government centralised, right, they're not going to ignore local communities. They have less personal involvement, so they're going to be more efficient. Why is this not true? Well, firstly, they don't hear from local communities. They're going to ignore them because they literally don't hear from them. The things that they go through are literally kept under wraps. They're confidential. Local people cannot submit on them. You can't submit to a minister, so that just doesn't happen. And also the no personal involvement means that they have less knowledge about these communities. They don't have the ability to just ignore them because they don't even know about them in the first place. They don't know about what they want. They're not even hearing from these people. Even if they get experts, they're not likely to be listened to, and they don't have to listen to these experts. And we bought you material at first and at second on why they're not likely to listen to experts, even if they manage to get good ones in. So, what do we see at the end of this, right? Let's say that at the end of this, you still believe that none of this is true, right? Why does power still not become significantly cheaper? Why can they not get their humps? Firstly, companies control the prices. When it's so expensive to build this new renewable energy, and when the profit is just all that a company cares about, it's not going to go down in the first place. This means that they can't claim their massive benefit about single mothers caring about it, right? Secondly on this, old energy is going to be shut down. You're not going to get a large significantly more, and now you have this high capital, which Finn talked about. Thirdly, right, the power field which was built in South Auckland by your centralised government that decided to build it in South Auckland, that power's probably going to be diverted to Central Auckland. It's probably not going to go directly to only South Auckland. It's not only going to benefit them. You know when it will? When it's organised by the local community, when it's organised by local government for that specific community, when they're able to go, this is what is going to be best for our community, this is what we should do, rather than a centralised government being like, this is the best place to build it, we're going to build it here, we're going to build a massive one that encroaches on all of South Auckland, and then divert all this power. So this means that they cannot claim their benefits. All of the side effects should far outweigh, and even if you only believe a little bit of our material, we should still win because of the detrimental harms to minorities. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and as is customary, reverse the speaking order and invite the negating reply speaker to finish their team's case.
Note, Riley gave you a whole point on the harms of centralisation and the effects on democracy, which went broadly unresponded to and was dropped down their line. This will build our margin in today's debate. Note that the environment was dropped after our second speech, which we won on because I spent ages talking about it, disproving it beyond any reasonable doubt, and then they didn't spend a second on it. 2 points of clash in our debate. Firstly, on the cost of power, and secondly, on consultation. So on the cost of power, what do we hear from the affirming side? They said that the cost of living is the most important issue facing people, and so we need to get cheaper power. We can agree with this, but where we disagree is at the point where they say you can only get cheaper power by building it quicker. They say this only happens because only when you build it quicker can you build more, can you build like better quality power, which will get the costs down for families. Where we disagree here is we say, actually, the problem isn't councils not approving wind farms. The problem might be that they take too long to do it. That's the case that they needed to run, because at the end of today's debate, we get the same wind farms, even if it takes a little longer. We told you, we have broadly the same incentives. We told you that councils just want to bring the power costs down too. I told you that councils want jobs, they want regional development. Councils want to protect the environment as well. So at the point where we have said that councils want to do all of this, we get no less wind farms built on our side. If you don't buy all of that, buy the material I told you where I said we actually get more wind farms because of 5 mechs that I gave you about political capital and about the actual appetite for renewable energy among the community. All that they responded to, they just broadly responded to this with a one-liner without really engaging with the point. So the meta for our response to the cost of power, we should be weighed much higher because we give you several layers. We say, actually, we get the same wind farms and we're happy to concede that it takes a little bit longer because at least then we get to consult with minorities. If you don't buy that, we say, actually, we get more wind farms. We gave that at our second speech, wasn't engaged with on their side, so you have to buy both of these and we have to win the cost of power. Next, on consultation. So we think this has been a big issue. Note that we told you that there was always going to be a trade-off in if you make something which takes a month and you compress it down, if you take that process and compress it down to a week, you will always necessarily get less consultation. But where this consultation is super important is in the small regions and on minorities. They said that they're going to protect Māori by having the treaty minister in the room. Note that this was dropped down the line because both Stella and I did excellent jobs at saying why that isn't true. Note also at third, they just entirely conceded Māori. They also said that they are quite happy to just concede that they don't consult with Timaru and that they get far worse outcomes for them because of that. What we said is that minority consultation is crucial and only happens on our side. We should weigh this mechanisation higher because it's an exclusive mech. They do not get a treaty minister into the room, we told you. They don't do what's best for Māori if they do get into the room, and if they do, then they just don't win the vote. They get outvoted. That's what we told you happens to the magical treaty minister, which somehow gets into the room. We said, even then, you don't have to screw over Timaru because even if somehow they were really malicious and Timaru wanted to make Aucklanders freeze, you can actually just get more power on, you can do right by Timaru. There's no trade-off required there. You can do right by Māori and get cheaper power. You can do all of these things because you don't have to make those hard choices. You just have to make the easy choice of voting yes. Because at the end of the day, our mix are exclusive about how they don't actually get cheaper power. We get more. This wasn't engaged to. You have to buy it. But now I'll let Teresa come up and hold you to ransom, saying why it's South Auckland or nothing, baby.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I invite the affirming reply speaker to close today's debate.
am not going to hold you to ransom about South Auckland, but I am going to ask why, even if you believe local government makes better decisions are more important than faster decisions. I'm going to ask you why you think that as the team arguing for fewer windmills, for fewer solar panels, and even if you aren't arguing for fewer, arguing for them at a slower rate, right? So let's not talk about South Auckland. Let's first talk about accessibility to power, because we think that notably this affects the whole country and not just a few small groups. So on accessibility, NEG can't defend their case today by telling us ours wasn't mechanised, when our first speaker explained very clearly that incentives for local councils are not in the interest of the country, and when he explained that the capacity of councils means things go much slower if they do get through at all, right? We mechanise this when at third we come out and we compare the value of a windmill to a locally motivated councillor, and then to a person in the rest of the country who needs power now, for this winter, for next winter, in time for their baby to come, in time for their end of year exams, in time for the things that you need power for right now or next week, not in a year's time when the councillors have gone through their consent process, right? We say that accessibility to energy is really important, both on just like a is it there in time level and on a like cost level. And they tell us that it can still be profitable to make energy in the status quo because people need it, right? But if it were profitable to do that, then we wouldn't have people struggling to make ends meet. We wouldn't have people sleeping in the freezing cold. We wouldn't have people studying in the dark, right? And additionally, if it were profitable to do the renewable energy thing, as they try and characterize to you at third, then we would have 100% green energy now in the status quo, as we explained to you at our third speaker. We tell you that it is necessarily a block to Meridian and Meridian and the like to have to go through this whole process with a council that's ultimately more expensive than it would be to just like access your profits with a fast track approval process in like 3 weeks, right? We tell you about this distinction that we now have for energy companies between going through a long approval process for an otherwise slightly cheaper option of making a coal mine, right? Then just getting the box ticked in 7 days and being able to access those profits now. Regardless of if, that's how they should be thinking, it's how they do think. We see that companies think with profit in mind, we've agreed on that. And we think that that means under our side, we get faster windmills and better windmills rather than coal mines and slower coal mines. Anyway, we don't see 100% green energy now because we currently import cheap power. We currently have Meridian giving up because of how difficult it is to get a proposal through. So we have proven to you down the line that we get more energy. We have proven to you that that energy ratio is cleaner, and we think that that's a massive benefit because of all the impacting we did all the way, right? But let's look at minorities and vulnerable people because they tell you they can win on just this point. Okay, it's unclear why the negative team thinks that it's strategic to focus on minorities, considering energy is universally important, as I tell you, and so minorities, as majority groups do, care about energy a lot. It affects everyone, right? And we give you impacting for this at second. We think the most vulnerable people in the country actually are those who are living on the poverty line, who I explained to you at second, are needing power in their homes to survive, are struggling under the status quo and need a new windmill, even if it makes life a little bit noisier for those in Timaru, right? Those are the people we're helping. Those are the people we uniquely give a new and give cheaper, cleaner energy to. We don't hear at all why it's a priority for Māori people to maintain that specific awa down the road than to keep the lights on for their family, right? We never hear mechanisation for why that's their priority, and therefore we think that we also win on minorities, right? So regardless of the metric you can use immediacy of impact, you can use number of people, you can use vulnerability, any metric, and we win.
Congratulations both teams for surviving another round of nationals. Cross the floor and shake hands, and I will turn off the live stream.
Good job. That's great.